Hello and welcome to Braver Leaders, the podcast. Today I wanted to talk about the imposter syndrome. One of those phrases that tends to be in the public consciousness. You've possibly used it yourself, or perhaps from time to time wondered whether you were experiencing the imposter syndrome. So let's look at this in a bit more detail. To begin, we're going to open up Wikipedia. Wikipedia tells us that the imposter phenomenon was introduced in an article in 1978. Yes, the imposter phenomenon, or the imposter syndrome. And the article was titled "The Imposter Phenomenon in High Achieving Women, Dynamics and Therapeutic Intervention" by Pauline Clance and Suzanne Imes. Hope I've got the pronunciation correct. They defined imposter phenomenon as an internal experience of intellectual phoniness. Intellectual phoniness. I love that. And of course it's morphed now into the imposter syndrome. And there have been many articles written, several books, and a lot of people talk about the imposter syndrome. So what we're going to do today is to use 3 articles to build a bit of a framework of understanding. I'm not going to read out every part of those 3 articles. I would encourage you to read them. They're really interesting. The links will be in the description. So here's article number 1. Imposter Syndrome, Why You May Feel Like a Fraud. Goes on to say, if you wonder whether you might have imposter syndrome, ask yourself the following questions. Do you agonize over even the smallest mistakes or flaws in your work? Yes, sometimes. Do you attribute your success to luck or outside factors? Of course I've done that. Are you sensitive to even constructive criticism? Occasionally. Do you feel like you will inevitably be found out as a phony? Yeah, now and again. Do you downplay your own expertise, even in areas where you are genuinely more skilled than others? Yes, I have done that, but I've got good reason. What I'm getting at here is that we've probably all felt something along these lines from time to time. And what I would say is that's not necessarily imposter syndrome. That can be perfectly natural, could even be healthy, and I'll come on to that much later. And I think the difference is whether this stuff is overpowering us, whether this is causing us to not be able to move or function in our lives. And this article again goes on to say, what does imposter syndrome feel like? An inability to realistically assess your competence and skills. Yes, sometimes that happens to me. Attributing your success to external factors. Done that. Berating your performance. Oh yes. Fear you won't live up to expectations. Well, yes, of course. Overachieving to try and compensate for those perceived lacks. Sometimes. Sabotaging your own success. Definitely. Self-doubt. Yeah, quite a lot. Setting very challenging goals and feeling disappointed when you fall short. I might have done that. Again, my point being that to feel these things in of themselves isn't necessarily imposter syndrome. Can be perfectly natural. Next article, You're Not a Fraud. Here's how to recognize and overcome imposter syndrome. Thank goodness, this is what we want. Imposter syndrome involves unfounded feelings of self-doubt and incompetence. You may be able to reduce these feelings by talking with people close to you or a mental health professional. I should add that imposter syndrome isn't a diagnosis that you'll find in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, or ICD, the International Classification of Diseases. Anyway, there are 5 types of imposters, according to Dr. Valerie Young, and she talks about them in more detail in her 2011 book, The Secret Thoughts of Successful Women, Why Capable People Suffer from the Imposter Syndrome and How to Thrive in Spite of It. So there's something that if you wanted more detail, you could delve into that. And it says successful women, but of course it applies to everyone. Actually, I'll come on to some of the stats later on, and you might be intrigued to find out how widespread the imposter syndrome can be. And let's go on to these 5 types. The perfectionist. We know perfectionism isn't perfection isn't realistic. Perfectionism is not a good thing to get into. None of us can be perfect all the time. Instead of acknowledging the hard work you put into something, you focus on the thing that you failed at, and maybe it was tiny, but that failure, inverted commas, well, you beat yourself up. You might be ashamed. Sometimes you're afraid to start new things in case you fail. I think that's happened to me. I've done all that. But once more, Is that all the time? No, because I learned to understand that or I maybe had to force myself to understand that failure, well, it's learning, isn't it? You can't succeed unless you fail, but if you flip the failure into learning, then that's how you progress. And also, there are times we back away from big challenges, but we know also that we have to go and do them. And something that helped me was to think about the phrase, don't let great get in the way of good. And if you substitute it to perfection, don't let perfectionism or being perfect get in the way of good enough. Sometimes good enough is good enough. The natural genius. You spent your life picking up new skills easily, and you believe that competent people can handle anything with little difficulty, and that leads you to feel like a fraud if you've had a hard time understanding something, if it doesn't come easily to you. It can be all sorts of reasons. Maybe up until that point it was in the same area, the same subject, maybe it was a different teacher, lecturer, different thing happened at work, things are explained to you in a way that doesn't sit well, and so on. And we can feel ashamed and we can feel embarrassed because we're used to, particularly I think when you get into various habitual ways of leading your life, maybe you're not you're challenging yourself enough. And that's probably the reason that it seemed harder, because all of a sudden you've forgotten what it was like to learn something from scratch. But that embarrassment that maybe we've all felt from time to time, generally we'll bounce back from it and put things in perspective. And once more, if somebody isn't putting things in perspective, I think this is where the challenges and issues can be. The rugged individualist or soloist, you believe you should be able to handle everything solo. If you can't achieve success independently, you consider yourself unworthy. Asking someone for help or support doesn't just mean failing your own high standards. It also means admitting your inadequacies and showing yourself as a failure. And again, that's not, that's not clear thinking, is it? We're all interdependent. None of us are independent, truly. Who made the phone you use or the car that you drive and so on. We need other people. We need that input. We need that help. So if someone thinks, well, I've had to ask for help, that's failure. I don't think so. I think there's one example of where we really should be talking to someone. The expert. Before you can consider your work a success, you want to learn everything there is to know on the topic. You spend so much time pursuing your quest for information that you end up having to devote more time to your main task. You spend so much time pursuing your quest for more information that you end up having to devote more time to your main task. In other words, you're stealing the time from the task to get the information. Since you believe you should have all the answers, you might consider yourself a fraud or failure when you can't answer a question or encounter some knowledge you previously missed. I've been there as well. And I have been there. And I do like to know things, and I do like to delve further and further into it. And I do from time to time feel that I should know more. But again, what this is saying is, if that becomes an obsession, if it immobilizes us, if it causes us to freeze, to not move forward in our lives, rather than just a blip, then this could be an issue. The superhero. You link competence to your ability to succeed in every role you hold, student, friend, employee, or parent. Failing to successfully navigate the demands of these roles simply proves, in your opinion, your inadequacy. To succeed, then, you push yourself to the limit, expending as much energy as possible in every role. Still, even this maximum effort may not resolve your imposter feelings. You might think, I should be able to do more, or this should be easier. And once more, this is a trap that many of us have fallen into, particularly when we look at the so-called role models. And then, of course, through time, you hear the story behind the scenes that it was awful, that they couldn't do it, that they cried every night, that they needed to get a lot of help, that they damaged their mental and physical health. So we have to be very careful of comparing ourselves to others in that way, because we don't know what goes on behind the scenes. And being a superhero in these ways, particularly today with everything so complex, so busy, I think is a recipe for disappointment, to say the least. So we've got to be aware of that. And then we get on to how do we deal with this? Now, this is I think interesting, because I do agree with a lot of what's written here. So if you feel like a fraud, working harder to do better may not do much to change your self-image. These strategies can help you resolve imposter feelings productively. So number one, acknowledge your feelings. Very good idea. Identifying imposter feelings and bringing them out into the light of day can accomplish several things or goals. Talking to a trusted friend or mentor about your distress can help you get some outside context. Definitely. We should all be doing that anyway. Don't bottle things up. Speak to people. Trusted friend, mentor, coach, whoever it may be. Sharing imposter feelings can help them feel less overwhelming. Saying it out loud, telling someone about it can help diminish that feeling. Getting that other opinion, I think, is a great idea. Opening up to peers about how you feel encourages them to do the same, helping you realise you aren't the only one who has these feelings. Now, I'd say yes, perhaps opening up to peers, but we've got to put that in context, right? Sometimes that wouldn't be a good thing to do, depending on the environment. But certainly, trusted friend, mentor, sharing those feelings. Build connections. Avoid giving in to the urge to do everything yourself. So we're talking about a network. A network can offer guidance and support, validate your strengths, encourage your efforts to grow. So it's kind of similar to the last one, which I like. I like this as well. A network, spreading the load, sharing imposter feelings can help others say they feel the same. You'd be amazed how many people feel like this. And when you get that, oh, you too? That's why I was sharing some stuff earlier with you. You felt like that? Yeah, of course. Because I think this is more normal than we realise. But once more, there's a spectrum. There's an intensity of these feelings which can become very much imposter syndrome. And further away from that, stuff that probably we all feel from time to time, that recognising it is important, but also overcoming it, like talking to friends. Sometimes, of course, it may need to be a mental health professional, as we'll see, depending on what it's linked to. And then also, we're encouraged to challenge our doubts. It says it at the top there, when imposter feelings surface, ask yourself whether any actual facts support these beliefs, then look for pieces of evidence to counter them. So this is about CBT, and one of the challenges with some versions of CBT and this is that if you are feeling those emotions strongly, then this requires some logical thinking, and different parts of the brain can be dominant when we're thinking logically or thinking and feeling emotions and emotionally. So I would say this is another situation where it's good to do this with someone else, to borrow their logic when you're too close to it. You may be able to do it yourself, but I'd link it with those other things and keep on, I suppose, pushing my agenda of encouraging you, if you're feeling anything like this, to reach out, to talk to people, the friend, the mentor, peer group, if possible, to help you challenge those doubts in this case with that conversation. Because they may say, what, really? Well, have you thought about this? Oh, no, I hadn't thought about that. You may be able to do that on your own, but you may be too close to see it. And then avoid comparing yourself to others. Almost no one can do it all. It's okay to need a little time to learn something new, even if someone else seems to grasp that skill immediately. This is, I think, again, really good advice. Comparing ourselves to others is ultimately dangerous, because we can get into the trap of social comparison and looking at other people. And sometimes that can motivate us, but what we're saying here is this is when we compare to people who've got something we don't, an ability to comprehend things perhaps, an ability to overcome particular problems. We don't know how they're able to do that. We don't know what gave them the capacity, capability to do it. We don't know how many times they failed. We don't know what's going on behind the scenes. We don't know how many people they have to help and so on. So instead, I think what's healthier is to compare ourselves to who we were yesterday, to our own progress. That's ultimately, I think, a really good thing to do anyway, because it can help us on our way to our goals. It can allow us to understand that, hey, we are making that progress, and that can give us that sense of efficacy and control, and perhaps even bolster our sense of purpose. But comparing ourselves to others is generally a bad idea. So I would totally agree with that. Avoid, if at all possible. And then it says here in this article, existing mental health symptoms. Fear of failure can prompt plenty of emotional distress. Many people coping with imposter feelings also experience anxiety and depression. But living with depression or anxiety might mean you already experience self-doubt, diminished self-confidence, and worries around how others perceive you. The mindset of feeling less than can both lead to and reinforce the belief that you don't really belong in your academic or professional environment. Imposter syndrome can worsen mental health systems, creating a cycle that's difficult to break. I would agree with that. It mentions out of the blue, because I've skipped parts of the article, I've left bits out, your academic and professional environment. We'll talk about that, not because this is necessarily anything to do with academic or professional, but in a way or I mention this in a way to really highlight the prevalence of imposter syndrome, and also who it can affect, which is pretty much everyone. So to do that, let's look at this article. And it says here, people who struggle with imposter syndrome believe that they are undeserving of their achievements and the high esteem in which they are, in fact, generally held. They feel that they aren't as competent or intelligent as others might think, and that soon enough people will discover the truth about them. That's a common thing, but you may also have felt that. Those with imposter syndrome, which is not an official diagnosis, there we are there, are often well accomplished. They may hold high office or have numerous academic degrees, and the point here is that it almost doesn't matter what you've achieved. You can have these feelings, but once more I would differentiate between having feelings of self-doubt and occasionally having the feeling of, I'm going to get found out here. I mean, I'm no different from this person or that person. I don't think that that's that unusual, but I would say again, it's when this becomes all-encompassing, when it's constricting and restricting us. So we'll continue with this article. Why do people with imposter syndrome feel like frauds, even though there is abundant evidence of their success? Instead of acknowledging their capabilities as well as their efforts, they often attribute their accomplishments to external transient causes such as luck, good timing, or effort that they cannot regularly expend. Whether in the areas of academic achievement or career success, a person can struggle with pressure and personal expectations. So some echoes of what was in one of the other articles. But again, I'm leaving this in because I think it's worth emphasizing that when we attribute things to external influences too much, then we're forgetting about something called the internal locus of control. We tend to be much more healthier psychologically if we understand how much we are agents of change in our own lives. When we attribute everything out there rather than internal locus of control, that's called external locus of control, then we get miserable and we feel that we're just buffeted around by the vagaries of life, and that's not a good thing. And I think there's echoes of imposter syndrome in there, which is why I'm highlighting this part of this article. And back to this idea about potentially mental health, and in this case personality traits. It says here that they can largely drive imposter syndrome. So although imposter syndrome itself is not a diagnosis as such, although there are various things you can do, I think there's a test you can take, Those who experience it struggle with self-efficacy. I mentioned efficacy already. So they struggle with that this feeling that they can cause changes in their life, that they are an agent of change, that can allow them to get where they want to get to. They can't control everything, but there's quite a lot that they can control, that we can control in our lives. But again, that's internal locus rather than external. And perfectionism that I mentioned already, and neuroticism. Again, a personality trait that is within the population and relatively prevalent. And competitive environments also lay the groundwork. So for example, many people who go on to develop feelings of imposterism, first article to mention that, faced intense pressure about academic achievement from their parents in childhood. So what we're beginning to see here is there's a mixture of personality traits, the environment being competitive, and maybe some things from childhood. And so although an umbrella term could be imposter syndrome, I personally don't think that's that useful, because I think people are complex and unique and different. And I think it's better to say, oh, okay, hey, I had some of these feelings and I could call it imposter syndrome. But I think it's crucial to look at the component parts for a lot of people, which is also why when it really is something that is debilitating and not those fleeting moments that we all get, when something is really getting to us and restricting and confining and overpowering us, that it's really useful to talk to people. And could be a coach, could be a mentor, but as I mentioned earlier, and this is why, it could be a mental health professional. So, how common is imposter syndrome? Around 25 to 30% of high achievers may suffer from imposter syndrome, and around 70% of adults may experience imposterism at least once in their lifetime. I think the 70% is low. I think adults experience imposterism. I think about 100%. Now, not quite, but I think it's probably higher than 70. But it's a lot of people, right? That's why it's important to talk about it and recognize that we all feel it. And 25 to 30% of high achievers may suffer from imposter syndrome. Now, what this article hasn't done is define high achievers. So what population, what part of the population are they? And of that given population, ill-defined, not defined here, 25 to 30% are they all experiencing the same thing? But suffice it to say, I think that certainly in terms of the actual imposter syndrome itself, that debilitating thing that overpowers, that causes real problems in our lives, I don't think anybody knows what the percentage is, but it's out there and it is experienced by people. Once more, they should reach out, ask for help. But in terms of those things that we would say, to go back to the beginning of this podcast, that we would talk about, because it's in the public consciousness. Hey, imposter syndrome, yeah, I had that and I had that. I think that's really common. And that leads me to my thoughts on this to finish off. I think that if we are actually in this role of having imposter syndrome, that's definitely professional help. If we are prone to having those fleeting little thoughts skip across our minds, then when that starts to happen, I believe that one way to look at it is that it's actually stopping you from becoming an imposter or the imposter. So let's say you're in a role and you think, oh, I've got an imposter feeling thing again, and am I good enough? Then recognize it as being something that's protecting you, that's actually making you better in terms of your self-leadership, or maybe in your role in your job, or maybe both, maybe also in your family. Because the true imposters who are out there, they are the dangerous ones. They are the self-aggrandizing ones, the delusional, the blinkered, the arrogant and the narrow-minded. Think about it. If someone never feels, never even has any doubt, never thinks, oh, I should have done better, then they can be self-aggrandizing, can't they? Those are often the people who talk about how wonderful they are and put other people down around them. If you get those little thoughts of self-doubt, etc., it's likely to prick that little bubble of ego that may have been forming around you. It keeps us humble. That fleeting form of, well, will I call it imposter syndrome? Imposterism, probably better. Delusional. People who think that they are wonderful and great in particular roles. They have not only an inflated vision of themselves, but also their place in the world. And it's delusional, it's not real. So once more, that imposterism creeping in, galloping across our thinking for a little period of time can help us be grounded and realize that no, we can't do all that stuff. We aren't the superhero. And then blinkered, people who are aggrandizing, delusional, are often blinkered. This links with arrogance as well. So they're blinkered, they won't listen to any other opinions, sometimes because they're a little bit feeble-minded, to be honest. They're not able to open up and consider that, there's all this stuff out there, because I won't do that because I might not understand it, and that might mean that I'd fail and I'd look bad. So they're blinkered, they're not even accessing any of that stuff. They're delusional enough to think they know it all. Whereas what's that definition of wisdom is getting to that point where you realize how little you know. That's wisdom. This individual, blinkered? No. And arrogant, of course, arrogant enough to think that they don't have to look out there. Again, reinforced by delusional and self-aggrandizing thinking. And so the narrow-minded bit, I think, is ultimately a feature of some of those other traits, if I would call them that. And I just think that imposterism, or at least I've found this to be the case, that when it comes in, I just feel it just grounds me. It makes me a better person. It causes me to double check, am I being humble?